Hello, I'd like to welcome all of you on this lovely afternoon, if you're somewhere in Europe, if you're outside of Europe, wherever it is in your time zone, to this ASEN webinar discussion on the topic, where's the sport in researching the nation? We are gathered to here with a group of great scholars who have specifically or generally dealt with sport and its interrelationship with the nation. But before I go into their CVs, and I told them before, and I'm telling you, they don't need any introduction, but nonetheless, just very briefly, I'd like to sort of just tell you very briefly what the idea is behind this event here today. It all started a few months back with a discussion on Twitter that saw the program of ASEN's, I won't say competitor, but the second big international associations for the study of nationalism, ASEN, that saw its program published for this year's ASN annual conference in New York, an online conference for the first time due to COVID-19 reasons, which saw a record number of panels and a record number of participants at the conference due to its online format. And what was striking to people like me and others also debating it on Twitter, that out of the huge amount of panels and papers, there was not a single paper on sports, having sport as their main point of empirical analysis. Now, this sort of evoked a debate on, has sport become peripheral in the mainstream study of nationalities and nationalism, or has it always been peripheral? What is the reason for it, or isn't there any reason? Are the fields of expertise and the fields of studies just in other academic disciplines? And out of this Twitter debate, more or less, David Landon Cole from ASEN and I decided to invite a group of scholars to debate this question. So it's the event today is rather less going to be about theoretical insights into the interrelationship of sport and nation, but more sort of broadly providing food for thought as to why or why hasn't sport become a central aspect of studying the nation, or not just central, but why has it been or hasn't it been overlooked? Now, I don't want to waste too much time. Just to very briefly, I'll outline the plan for today. We roughly have an hour and a little bit longer than that. After my introduction and the very short CVs of the participants today, I'll give the participants or the panelists 5 to 7 minutes to outline their thoughts on the topic. We'll follow up with the second round of the panelists replying or responding to each other. And after that, we will open up the Q&A session. You can ask questions depending on where you're watching this. So either YouTube Live, Facebook Live, or if you're an ASEN member, you can also post the questions directly in the Zoom chat. So without further ado, let me very briefly introduce the panelists today. So today we have with us Tsuko Ichiyo. She's an associate professor from the Kingston University, where she's at the School of Law, Social and Behavioral Sciences. She's very well known to everyone who's ever been to an ASEN event and follows ASEN, and particularly Nations and Nationalism as a leading journal in our field. She's a sociologist interested in nationalism, who's published widely on the theories of nationalism, investigating what nationalism is or its relationship with modernity, etc. Empirically focusing mostly on the British Isles and East Asia, but also European identity and European integration. and as said, published widely on citizenship and nationalism's relationship with religion. But something that I have very dear or very close to my heart is her work on the role of food in nationalism. I find that a very fascinating topic. Secondly, John Fox, professor of sociology from the School of Sociology, Politics, and International Studies of the University of Bristol, whose research interest, as said, as with the others, don't need an introduction, who's worked very widely on topics of ethnicity, racism, and migration in the fields, also in the empirical fields of Hungary, Romania, and the UK, who has been at the forefront of studying nationalism from below, the ways in which ordinary people reproduce ethnic, national, or racialized forms of collective belonging in their everyday lives. I don't think I need to mention his concept of everyday nationhood developed with Cynthia Miller-Idris, that many of us have used, and to many of whom it has been an inspiration. Richard Arnold, who's an associate professor of political science from Muskingum University, who comes to us from the US. So for him, it's good morning, I guess. Richard has a focus in Russian and European politics and ethnic conflict and hate crime, but has also published very widely on sports and politics. And I'd like to point out his co-editor or co-guest editorships on the Sochi 2014 Winter Olympics and the 2018 FIFA World Cup in Russia. And also, if interested in the topic, but not really a specialist, you can have a look, or you should have a look at his review on nationalism and sport, a review of field in review of the field, which is published in Nationalities Papers only last year, if I'm not mistaken. Richard, you can correct me on that. And then last, but certainly not least, Alan Banner, professor of sport and social theory at the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences, who's, and I think it's really, without exaggeration, globally a leading scholar in the field of sport and nationalism. Is the author of Sport, Nation and Globalization, European and North American Perspective from 2001, and has ever since published dozens and dozens of great articles and books, where I would only like to point out The Politics of the Olympics, a survey from 2010, the Rutledge Handbook on Sports and Politics from 2017, or the Sport and Body Cultures in East and Southeast Asia from 2018. Now, and I'll leave it, and I've said too much already, but I'd like to just as food for thought, leave you with two, or start with two direct citations from two nationalism scholars who all of us know and all of us have read, namely Michael Billig and Eric Hobsbawm. And what I would like to illustrate is their relationship or their interest in sport, despite both of them not having researched or having had sport as a central aspect of their research. They've nonetheless either touched upon it anecdotally in their work, or in the case of Eric Hobsbawm, they've wrote arguably the most quoted sentence in the field of, or in the study of sport and nationalism. So Eric Hobsbawm in 1991 wrote famously that the imagined community of millions seems more real as a team of 11 named people when talking about the mass spectacle of football, or the rise of the mass spectacle of football in interwar Europe, and thereby transforming, or so he argued, the individual to a symbol of his or her nation. Now, sort of a completely different generation of scholarship, and sort of also a theoretical approach. But Michael Billig, and I find that sort of one of the key moments in my research that sort of provided impetus for my own research, was his the way that the ambivalent way in which he described the contribution of sport towards the formation of collective identity. And here I quote, he says in Banal Nationalism from 1995, "Regularly I answer the invitation to celebrate national sporting triumphs. If a citizen from the homeland runs quicker or jumps higher than foreigners, I feel pleasure. Why? I don't know. I want the national team to beat the teams of the other countries, scoring more goals, runs, or whatever. International matches seem just so much more important than domestic ones. There is an extra thrill of competition with something indefinable at stake. And that will be it from me. And I hope that we can sort of approach a little bit this indefinable aspect, that the ambivalent aspect that Michael Billig is talking about. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Atsuko. And I'll just sort of in the order, the way that you're aligned on my screen, and give the word to you, Atsuko.
Thank you very much, Dario and David, for this invitation. Actually, when I first got an invitation for this event, I was slightly puzzled because sports and nationalism is not necessarily my my main thing. But I suppose because my first PhD student, long time ago, Anthony May, did a PhD thesis on football and novels in Scotland and Northern Ireland, which was examined by Alan Werner here with us today. And probably because of that, I've been looking at submissions to do with sports and nationalism for NNN. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why I've been kind of you thought, Dario and David, you thought that I might have something to say. And also, I suppose what I can also say, what I can possibly bring about, it's because of my interest in food and nationalism, which is also privileges somehow kind of everyday or bottom-up perspective. Perhaps that's where I may be able to say something that can be developed into the further insight. And I quite agree that the sports seems to be still, despite all this work by Alan, for instance, seems to be not kind of the major focus of nationalism studies. And when I think about it, I suppose one of the reasons probably because emotions or something, sports is, when you are looking at the sports and nationalism from the organizational or structural point of view, it seems to be okay to do it, particularly in the management studies, etc. But when you're talking about the kind of emotions or reactions Billig seems described, that you feel, you just feel, okay, fine, it's great. That from my point of view, if like Naomi Osaka the other day pulled out of French Open, I thought, oh, that's great that somebody, okay, Naomi Osaka has a bit of identity issue from Japanese point of view. But anyway, okay, so let's leave that. But anyway, yes, Japanese athletes perhaps making progress would be somehow interesting. And I do remember having a conversation with a friend of mine long time ago that she just said, you know, I'm not nationalistic, and she wasn't at all. She's not chauvinistic or xenophobic at all. But I like it when Japanese athletes win the Olympics. And I think that's what we want to deal with. But it is so ephemeral and difficult to define. That's why perhaps in sociology of emotion, emotions haven't been really looked at. It has changed over the perhaps last 10 years or something. But classically, there's Durkheim studies about collective effervescence and emotional contagion. But kind of conventionally, emotions are something that cannot be touched upon somehow by sociologists if you are kind of seriously minded. And that is because it is probably difficult to define, indefinable, as you said, Dario, difficult to come up with some sort of measurement or kind of indicators or indicators to some extent to be able to operationalize something called emotions, which is induced by sporting events or being involved with sport as such. And as Hobsbawm's quote, your quote has reminded me of Jim Shiller's famous comment that the Scots are 90 minutes nationalists. That they can be Scottish through and through while their team is taking on the England, but that's it. It doesn't translate it to political action, which is, I mean, it has changed over the years. But when Jim Shirers made this comment, he was saying that the Scots are not seriously nationalistic in a sense that they can be nationalistic during the sports match, but not in the ballot box. So this perception that the emotion or sport emotion does not translate into concrete political action, again, somehow can color how scholars, researchers try to investigate this. And I find it, I find it especially interesting in this regard is that the emotion, if emotion is difficult to study because so ephemeral and difficult to measure and difficult to define, there's, I think, certain similar sort of snobbishness about studying materiality. Like when I do remember when I started working on the food and nationalism, my dear supervisor, Anthony Smith, was slightly skeptical because it was, I don't know, it wasn't, I think, high, in a way, it wasn't high culture enough. It wasn't, it was too everyday, too, etc. So I think, again, when you're dealing with some materiality in terms of nationalism, again, there's certain sort of hesitation or almost self-censorship on the part of those people studying it, not to take it, try to, not to, because they know that it won't be taken seriously, try to be defensive about it, etc., etc. So these are my comment, observations about why sports does not seems to be the major focus in nationalism studies.
Thank you, Atsuko. And sort of, as said in no particular order, could I ask you, Alan, to respond to this and also sort of to add your thoughts as to what we were debating?
Yes, certainly. I'm probably a bit different from everybody else and come at this from a different perspective. Although my background is in politics as an undergraduate and then with a PhD in political thought, I've worked for much of my career in sports science departments. And I suppose if I was asking a question to a group of people in sports science, I would probably be turning it round and say, where's the nation in research in sport? I think in terms of sport, it's in quite a healthy state. I think a lot of us, certainly sociologists amongst us, are looking often at the relationship between sport, nations, national identities. But I think there is something about the character of sports science departments that possibly makes it harder for us to to perhaps feel that we would be welcome in mainstream nationalism studies. Now, I've never really felt that because I suppose of my background, and a lot of the earlier or more senior researchers in sociology of sport did come from outside of sport and did have degrees in politics, sport, history, sociology, literature. And that's changed. The majority of young scholars who are doing critical studies in sport departments, I would say that's the majority of all scholars in that area. And are probably people who have studied sport throughout their post-18 life. So they've done undergraduate degrees in sport and exercise science. They've done masters, if they're lucky in the sociology of sport, although there's not many of them around these days. And they've done PhDs in various aspects of this relationship between sport and politics. Now, when they come to publish, I think first of all, they would look at mainstream nationalism studies and think they might not take us seriously. And it echoes a point that Asuko has just made about food and nationalism. This idea that this is a bit trivial. You know, if one was working on religion and nationalism, that would be taken seriously, language and nationalism. But there is that sense that we're dealing with something that might be seen by others as relatively trivial. We're also trapped, I think, in our own departments, surrounded on one side by the sport scientists and on the other by people who do sport management. And again, as Suko mentioned, the management people are possibly taken seriously even in mainstream management journals because they're dealing with the management and organization of sport. The sport scientists simply don't, I think, take us seriously at all. And of course, they measure their own work using metrics in particular and income generation. And so we finish up very much as the poor relations, I think, in our own department. And in striving to combat that, we probably spend a lot more of our time trying to get published in sport-related journals, some of which have higher impact factors than the main nationalism journals, but of course are nowhere near the sort of journals that our sport science colleagues are publishing in. I think that's where we have these limitations. They're partly self-imposed, but they're also, I think, because we think we wouldn't be taken seriously by the wider nationalism studies community, and we know we're not taken particularly serious by the hardline sports scientists. So that, I think, helps to explain our situation to some extent. There are some of us, I guess, who are still old enough or possibly courageous enough to say, no, we can publish where we like, and we will try to engage with a wider audience than simply our own kind of niche area. But that's not always the case. Just to go back to another point that Tsuko mentioned, it's interesting that the Euro is coming up. I would have said in the past that I was a 90-minute nationalist, a 90-minute patriot. And my good friends, Graham Walker and Jack Garvey, of course, edited a book with that title in relation to the making of the Scottish nation. And I think Jim Sillars was right at the time. And of course, what's happened is subsequently that so many of us who were 90-minute patriots are now seekers of Scottish independence. I wouldn't say we're necessarily nationalists, and we grew up thinking that the nationalists were a pretty eccentric and odd bunch in Scotland. But there's been that huge transformation. And I started, and I didn't begin by studying nationalism. My PhD was on Antonio Gramsci's theory of the state. And I was interested even at that time in the mid-1970s, or mid to late 1970s, in some of the scholars who were working on Scotland and more generally the United Kingdom, From a Gramscian perspective, one of them, of course, being Tom Nairn, the history of Britain, who, a strange coincidence, attended the same secondary school as I did also a few years earlier. And so I spent 2 chapters in that thesis looking at that kind of literature. So it's always been there. But the current developments have to some extent made it easier to come out in terms of speaking about Scottish independence. And that, I think, helps me perhaps again to access a slightly wider audience.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'd like to pick up on your provocative argument and pose that question to John. Of scholars, nationalism scholars looking at sport, particularly early career researchers, not being taken seriously. John, is that the reason why your 2006 article remains one of the few ones where you've explicitly dealt with sport and the nation, and you've put that field, sort of empirical field, to the side, or are there other reasons for that?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's down to that. I think it's probably too naive to kind of pick up on something that's the thing you see in retrospect more than before that type of thing takes place. So, yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I haven't thought about it in those terms, but it's I guess my perspective on why sport has been peripheral to nationalism has to do with, again, and so from the everyday nationalism perspective, it has to do with the dominance of more top-down approaches to the study of nationalism. And I think it's hard. I mean, this kind of chimes in with some of the things that Atsuko was saying. I think it's hard. I think top-down nationalism, or the study of top-down nationalism, doesn't quite know what to do with sport, right? So it's you know. And I'm not sure why, because if you look at Richard's work, I mean, obviously there's a strong connection between what the state's interest in sports. So there's plenty of examples, like Alan's too, and so we can see that in a number of cases. But as you sort of set the stage, Dario, that seems to be a minority perspective rather than a majority one. And so most top-down approaches are interested in kind of go-to suspects for top-down nationalism, education, and religion, and maybe censuses here and again, or something like that. So there's a lot of kind of not state institutions that are explicitly implicated in the making of nations. Sport is more kind of very often tangentially implicated in the making of nations, and so I think it doesn't seem like the obvious kind of place to go, which is really a shame, because if you just reverse the lens, if you look at things from below, then sport becomes so obvious, right? So if from the everyday nationalism perspective, you're interested in how nationhood, or how the nation is experienced and reproduced in the lives of people in their everyday lives, and how those people become complicit in the production and reproduction of nations. And so you don't follow the kind of production chains, the top-down perspectives. You start with consumption chains, or not even consumption, but you start with the perspective of people in their everyday lives. And people are, of course, obsessed with sport, or not everyone, but many, many people are obsessed with sport. And so we see that, from there, it's just, I think that's how I stumbled upon it in my research. I didn't go out looking for sport. Sport found me when I was looking at everyday nationalism in Romania and Transylvania. And it was unavoidable then as a topic, because it's what people talk about. And not only do they talk about it in national terms. I mean, the point you were making earlier, Dario, is that or in reference to I think it was Billig, that when we're watching international sporting competitions, we've been invited to see that as a contest between nations, right? And then we have the whole national regalia there to remind us in case we've somehow forgotten, right? This isn't Premiership football. This isn't some kind of other football. This is Euro 2020. This is an international competition where the competitors are all national competitors. And so the experience of that is a national experience. Doesn't mean it's a nationalist experience, but it's a national experience. The starting point is that it's a national experience. And so from an everyday perspective, it's hugely important. I think it's important not just because the symbols of the nation are on display in those sorts of contexts, and where they wouldn't be on display in other contexts, or at least not with the fervor that we see in international sporting competitions. But also because, and related to that point, it's the intensity of the experience, and that is something that Atsuko was emphasizing when she was talking about emotions, or that Billig was talking about when he was trying to put his finger on, why is it that we're kind of so attached to this kind of international sport? And I too, like Atsuko, would reference Durkheim's work here on collective effervescence, and I think I think this term is overused, and I think it's actually a very elusive concept. But if the closest we get to it, is not with these sort of staid national holiday commemorations, or with all due respect to Prince Philip or something. These are not the kind of funerals and weddings and things like this, or jubilees or something. I mean, we might watch them, we might be interested in them, but they're not generating that kind of frothing at the mouth excitement that we get when we're watching World Cup football or international sports or the Olympics or something like that. And I think that's the kind of thing. It's how Durkheim describes collective effervescence, where you have the emblems of the nation on display to tell us what our experience of that collective effervescence is. What's the name we give it? How do we understand that? And that, I think, is hugely important to thinking about how national identities or national awareness or national categories are sustained, right? There's a kind of momentary exuberance that occurs during the sporting match. We're all fixated on the action. We have the drama of the action to draw us into it. We don't have drama in a funeral. We don't have drama in a wedding or in a national holiday commemoration, or at least not of the same kind of character. But we do in all sports, right? And it's not even just repeated once a year, once every 4 years, there's for the Olympics or something, but there's always something on television we can watch, right? Some international competition on television that we can watch that can draw us into that. And so this is hugely important for the sustaining of national sensibilities from below. It gives us things that other events don't give us. It gives us the intensity of that experience, and it allows us also to tap into the nation in ways that we wouldn't normally do in our routine everyday lives. I mean, this is the point that I make in my work on everyday nationhood, which is that add up everything we do with the nation, it's not a whole lot, right? So we are complicit in the reproduction of nations, but we're not as invested in this kind of project as people might assume, or scholars might assume that we would be. And so this is one of those instances where we are invested in it. We're very much invested in it. It's one of the very few instances. So I think sport is hugely important. I'd like to see more research done on it, and in response to Alan, to see, like him, I'd like to see it taken more seriously. And that's something that deserves more attention.
Thank you very much, John. Richard, what are we missing? You have the overview of the field. You just published the literature review last year. You should know which are the top-down, from below perspectives that we need to engage with in order to make sport a more central point of reference for the studying of not just historical, but particularly sort of everyday nationalities, identities, forms of belonging, etc. I don't want to put you too much on the point, but I was sort of I'm really interested in hearing your perspective on this.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. It was great to get the invitation. I wanted to just say that I think whether John and Atsuko had some really great points. There's this idea of emotionality, and the fact that the field has really been focused on other questions. So we're coming quite late to the study of sport. I looked over the literature review, which I conducted in my nationalism and sport piece, and I think I counted 47 pieces published in the last 15 years that I cited out of the 60 odd I had there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my background. I came to the study of sport and nationalism because my initial work focused on hate crime in Russia, and I was looking at skinhead groups. And the more and more I looked into the organization of skinhead groups, the greater role was seen to be played by sporting organizations. So I came, I guess, not in a very nice way into into studying this, and of course, you know, having memories of such people when I was growing up in the UK. You know, we had some extremists in the local sports stadium. So to turn to your, so I think this is really the idea that the field has been caught up with other questions, and looking at let's say the ethnic or civic definition of the nation, looking at how nationalism perpetuates itself and where nationalism came from as an ideology. I think there's a perception in the field that sport is somehow, I think it was Alan who mentioned that sport is somehow seen as not being a serious subject, seen as being something a bit frivolous, a bit fun, but it does have that intensity of emotionality that Atsuko mentioned. So I think there's a lot of scope for a future research agenda on sport. I wanted to look at some particular lines of inquiry, which really gets to your question, Dario, as to how the idea could move forward. I think there's an interesting dimension to be taken on looking at sport and recognition, and how nation and non-recognized nations take on sports, take on the attributes of nations and act in nation-like ways in order to perpetuate their existence. And I'm going to be looking at that in the cases of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in the fall. I'm actually really interested in Crimea because Crimea has been given a ban from European football. No Crimean club is allowed to participate in European football in the forthcoming season. And so when they when that ban eventually gets revoked, as I'm sure it will, I think that will be very interesting. But I'm also interested, and this is something you didn't mention, but it's a very new publication. I have a new book out on the 2018 World Cup. It's an edited volume. It's probably for Routledge. I think the title is something like Russia and the 2018 FIFA World Cup. There's a very good essay in there by a scholar called Michael Cole, where he looks at the concept of football and populism, and how right-wing politicians particularly instrumentalize football as a way of constructing the nation and of reaching out to the common people. And I think perhaps its association with populism and populism and associated phenomena is another way in which sport has been overlooked by the field of nationality studies. Sport and gender. I think there's a really interesting connection to be made, and the question of why women's sports are so unpopular and what that says about the gendering of the nation and how nations assume gender characteristics. I'm struck time and again by the fact that, you know, the United States is probably the world leader, or the United States or Great Britain are some of the world leading nations in terms of women's sports, but you know that so rarely gets discussed that all the focus is on men's sports. So I think there are top-down practices that nations embark upon, thinking of North Korea or other instances. North Korea is the one that comes to mind, where they try and impress particular sports onto their nations as a way of defining a national game. The Russians are trying to get Sambo, which is a martial art mixed between judo and something else, into the Olympics, trying to get recognized as an international sport, or played in the Olympics. There's an interesting, so there's official top-down ways in which nations try and impress upon their populations particular sports which discipline the nation in some respects. And then there's also, you know, this bottom-up perspective that I think has a lot of really interesting potential. Particularly looking, one area I didn't mention was that I'm particularly interested in this idea of people learning facts about the nation in which they live through sport, coming to know the places in the nation, coming to know the places that constitute their nation through the idea of sport. I remember watching the the football results on a Saturday afternoon in Britain and learning, oh, you know, this is what I associate with this place and this is association with that. So I didn't start out my career on sport, which perhaps goes to some of the points made earlier in this conversation. I started out to focus on extremism and violence, really. But I came to the study of sport because more and more there were connections involved with what I had previously, and it was just very interesting. And so, yeah, I think the real focus on this is the field's been busy with other questions. So.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this very sort of short but still impressive literature review of sorts of what is going on and what are potential avenues for future research. I'd like to give all of you sort of the chance to respond to what you've heard from the other three panelists, but also maybe with the question in mind of how to, and I don't like this sort of bridging the gap, but how to start this conversation among sort of, as Alan has insinuated, fields that are partially separated or sort of talk in certain bubbles with each other. Richard is a perfect example that has sort of, you know, bridged this gap with this publication, Nationalities Papers. Alan's work is certainly also read widely outside of the field of sports studies. But, you know, how do we get sport to the point where it's taken equally serious as the study of popular music or film studies in sort of more, let's say, acceptable forms of popular culture in nationalism studies? Ethnomusicology comes to mind. There's some, you know, a huge field in nationalism studies compared to sports studies. Now, as said, I'd like to give all of you sort of a chance to respond to what you've heard, and I'll start in the same order as in the first round. So Atsuko, I would like to give you the word for a quick response.
Okay. Yep. Very excited. It's interesting to hear that we seem to share certain observation about the state of sport. You know, how we study sport in relation to nationalism, and I very much concur with John in terms of the huge opportunity for in studying sports to look at how people in everyday life partake in nation building in an almost unreflexive manner, not necessarily very, very aware that they are making, you know, creating nation, but by acting, you know, participating and experiencing certain things together and forming a memory, and that will become the basis for their action, following, you know, subsequent action. This will accumulate to the extent that it becomes almost institutionalized as nation. And I think that's, you know, we need to be more vocal about how important it is, and I think what we need to do here is to think about how we can discuss, research, experience in a convincing manner, and not just, you know, convincing to myself, but can how do I know that these people are feeling that? How can I convince that these people next weekend, England Scotland match, they are really experiencing and creating Scottishness. How do I? So it's very much methodological issue as well as, yes, I think the methodology, how do we operationalize, conceptualize, and measure to a certain extent? That seems to be an important issue. And just to add to Richard's point, compare football World Cup, those football clubs which are not affiliated with FIFA because they are not independent nations, etc., etc. So obviously, football events, international events, are seen as actors on the ground as a legitimating mechanisms. So obviously, sports, as organized sports, organization of sports itself, international sports especially, is seen as having a legitimating function. And this, I think, again, this can be studied quite easily, I suppose. So we just need to look, our focus should be the experience and how we can reach that, how we can capture this, and how can we describe and explain it in a convincing manner.
Thank you, Atsuko. Alan, I'd like to extend the word to you.
Yes, I think events like this can help. I mean, I get the opportunity simply to speak across the sub-disciplines, if we can call them that. And maybe we need to try and generate more enthusiasm for those sort of get-togethers. We've also, I think, got to emphasize what are the key issues at the moment that might make us want to cooperate more or work with one another. Richard mentioned gender, and I think it is an important one. And something I've published things recently with Ali Bowes, who's at Nottingham Central University. First of all, it was about women who played elite sport for England and to what extent they thought they were the proxy warriors on behalf of the nation. We followed up that more recently with a couple of other people looking at the Solheim Cup in golf, in women's professional golf in the United States and Europe. And of course, there the perspective was slightly different because it was about European identity in terms of the players and the fans. The other two big issues, and one I think is secessionism. Yeah, Marianne Vashi at the University of Nevada and I published a book, edited collection at the beginning of this year on sport and secessionism. And just to take one example from that, and not one that Marianne and I wrote about, but the example of Biafra in Nigeria. And obviously, some of us are old enough to remember the Biafran Civil War or the Nigerian Civil War, and thousands and thousands of people dead both in the conflict and in the subsequent famine. And to some extent, it looked as if the flame of Biafran nationalism or separatism had gone. But there are still intimations of it, certainly amongst the Biafran population who live outside of Nigeria. And sport is so interesting in that regard, because if we look through the sports history books of the great Nigerian sports people, we would find that they were disproportionately Biafran. Where sport, on the other hand, is governed, if you take that top-down nationalism, by predominantly northern Nigerian administrators, politicians, and the like. And so you've got this top-down thing with the Biafrans thinking, if we had a separate football team, we'd do a lot better than the Nigerian football team would do without us. And yet this top-down sports policy thing of saying, we're all Nigerian, but Nigerian in the way that we want. The other one, of course, is populist nationalism, which, again, Richard mentioned. Just one example of that, I mean, how Prime Minister Modi was able not only to get the plans ahead to construct a biggest cricket stadium in the world in Ahmedabad, but then to give it his own name. And of course, his close relationship with people like Virat Kohli, the Indian Test captain, is so significant. In a country that is obsessed with cricket, apart from small parts of the Northeast, to have a politician like Modi able to also bring out to support him and show support, a cricketer like Kohli, revealed, as many other previous Indian cricketers were, almost as some demigod. So I think populist nationalism's use of sport is also an area that maybe there needs to be some collaboration on.
John?
Yeah, thanks, Dario. Yeah, and the Biafran example from Alan, I mean, takes me back to Romania too. So there's similar kind of dynamics there, and it just reminds us how rich of a topic of a topic this is, and also the thing that Alan started with, and the point about more stuff like this. I mean, I think he's right. Just kind of opportunity structures to encourage this kind of thing. So whether it's special issues in journals or PhD funding, let's say that. So lots of different things we can imagine that could encourage this kind of exploration. And I think it's central. I mean, nationalism is the field of nationalism, rightly so, is going under, I think, an important transformation right now to kind of get its head around world events and different things. And yet sport there's some continuity in that. I think that kind of weaves its way through that. And I'm not saying it isn't changing, it clearly is, but it still gives us something that I think we should not lose sight of. And so I hope that we find ways to kind of encourage people to look into these questions. On the methodological points that Otsuko raised, I mean, I agree with her, and yet I don't, in the sense that I mean, because for me, my interest in sport and the kind of Durkheimian collective effervescence, I mean, in this case, people wear their national colors on their sleeves, literally, right? So, I mean, this is nationhood, everyday nationhood is elusive. It's hard to kind of pin it down and think about it in terms of, if as a researcher, you don't want to go asking national questions of people, thereby supplying them the category that you're actually looking for. In sport, I think it's a little bit more obvious, as it were. And so, I mean, obviously that's not the end all of research on sports and nationalism, and the affective side, the emotional side of it does present challenges, but challenges that we can learn from other fields from on. And other people, Michael Skay, other people, Marko Antic are doing work on emotions, affective nationalisms. Other people are doing that too. So there's a lot of stuff that we can learn from there and just kind of switch gears and think about how that works in sports. And then, what was the last thing I wanted to say? I've forgotten, but let's just let other people ask questions anyhow. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
In terms of research on emotions and nationalism, I'd like to also point out Gordana Uzarat's work, who was invited to also participate today, but unfortunately couldn't make it. I think her work is very, very important to sort of exactly the points that you were making, John. But Richard, I'd also like to give you sort of a final round.
Yeah, just to, John mentioned people wearing their national colours on their sleeves. Well, in some cases, they wear them on their faces, right? You have a number of people painting their faces or other body parts at sporting events. In terms of encouraging or facilitating research on sport and nationalism, one thing that's been mentioned is special editions or special issues of journals, plus webinars or conferences like these, like the one we're currently experiencing. I want to, there's a golden opportunity, or there's a wonderful opportunity to affect that, because of course the Olympics is every 4 years and the World Cup is every 4 years, and in fact, I don't think I'll be able to do this, but if someone was interested in putting out a special edition of a journal on the Qatar World Cup 2022, I'd certainly be interested in reading that. It's been surrounded by controversy and really in the media limelight because of that. So I think that would be something I certainly would be very interested in. But yeah, I mean, I think more things like this, more understanding or more comprehension of the way in which states can create an environment in which it's acceptable to express certain opinions and certain emotions, and really contribute to that, those places where we have that idea of collective effervescence. And yeah, I wanted to sort of end by saying I don't think this is unique to nations. Right? That's the big thing that we're all, I think we're focusing on the nation here, and certainly nations are one way in which this happens, but there's also a lot of sporting fervour at the subnational level, and that is particularly evident in the United States. I happen to live in Columbus, which is a massive American football town. On game day, I live about 3 miles north of campus, and on game day, it's just crowded with people, thronged with people. And they're not participating in a national sporting event, but they are participating in a sporting event, and there's just scenes of exuberance and craziness. And I'm sure there's plenty of examples we can think of in that regard. So, you know, sports connected to communities, and the one thing that people do, just they get together, and there's one thing that groups do is they play sports and they interact in certain ways. So I think there's also a lot of potential in connecting the ways in which this manifests itself at the national versus the non-national level. At least that's the thought that occurs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And actually, it was a perfect transition into one of the questions that we got from David Stroup, who asked to what degree the interest in sport and nationalism rises and falls in salience with major events like the Olympics or the World Cup. And I mean, we're we're actually guilty of that as well, exploiting the fact that the Euros are starting next week to actually sort of trigger or to talk about the topic and to organize this webinar here. But he asks how we might then track sport and nationalism outside of these moments of international interest and salience. And maybe sort of I'm adding here to his question, you know, not to fall into the gap of researching the same thing under quotations every 4 years, and sort of adding and adding without innovating. I'll pose the question to the panel, and whoever would want to answer, please do.
I guess it is heightened certainly by these mega events. But as John said earlier on today, it's there the whole time on television and newspapers and the various online platforms now. So I think as a Scot, there's always something happening that reminds me through sport of my Scottishness. You know, it is, going back to that super point about Japanese athletes, I mean, that desire to see Scots do well. I mean, I look at golf results. I don't play golf. I would never go and watch a golf tournament. But at the same time, I am interested in seeing how Scottish golfers perform in these competitions. But of course, it's a sport where, always in brackets, it is Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, Wales. It's never GB in the reports of golf. But I think it's always there, and so there's always opportunities for this subject to be studied.
Yeah.
A further question asked is coming from an empirical perspective, asking whether taking pride in national sports teams is or can be used as an item of measuring nationalism. And the question is asked what the panel thinks of that. Is it an adequate measure for nationalism? Is it nationalist to support the national team? Or is it just national, as John has insinuated?
The question reminds me of, I think it was Norman Tebbett's cricket test, who asking immigrants which team they rooted for in the cricket. Was it India or was it England? I think just reminded me of that. I think it's one measure. I don't think it's certainly not complete on its own. And also, the some questions in the way, I just have to be careful about the way you phrased it, because pride is such an amorphous concept that it would need to be more particularly narrowed down. I'm presuming you're thinking of something like a survey question. That concept would be measured through about 3 or 4 different questions at least. Would be my response.
Can I also just comment on this, Daria? Yeah, so I basically agree with what Richard's saying. And I think it actually links back to some of the methodological concerns that Atsuko was raising. So in my view, when someone wears the national colors on her sleeves or paints her face in the national colors, as Richard alluded to, I think that's a fairly decent measure of some sort of national awareness. That is, that they are taking the flag and using that as some sort of fashion statement. So I think that is the bar for thinking, at least in this narrow context, about a kind of national awareness. I don't think that in itself says anything about nationalist sentiments, or a sort of nationalist, so a kind of much stronger kind of idea that in doing this, I'm making a statement about the greatness of my nation, apart, not just related to sport, but also more generally, or that that I have a strong attachments to my nation outside of sport. I mean, obviously that's possible, but if everyone who displayed that kind of exuberance at national sporting competitions went home and was a kind of fervent nationalist, displayed the same kind of fervor in their everyday lives, and we'd be in real trouble. I mean, I don't think those people are doing that sort of thing, and clearly, I mean, that's a different sort of research question. I think you need to go beyond the way people dress and start thinking about what are their views about far right politics, what are their views about immigration, what are their views about all sorts of things that we might measure, that Richard has worked on in his previous life or in current life as well, on hate crimes and things like this, and see if there's a higher proportion of those types of views in sport than there are in other domains of life. And my hunch is that there isn't that. I don't think there's any reason to think that that's kind of a correlation. Although some of Alan's work, Alan's work on earlier stuff on violence and hate crimes and hooliganism and things like that, I think does suggest that that's possible. But I still won't say that there's a kind of intrinsic link between those things.
And it's just a kind of, I was reminded of 2 things. First, it's whether the kind of pride and etc. in national team, it's different from how a particular player is represented. Classic example is Andy Murray. When he loses, he's a Scot, and when he wins, he's British. And I mean, so we need to have that kind of distinction. And also perhaps there's a subtle difference between the individual sport and a team sport, perhaps. So the French football team could be represented as Rainbow Nation, or South African rugby team can be represented as Rainbow Nation. That's what we identified with. But at the same time, very recently, when the English and was it Romanian as footballers took the knee, there was a booing, and so there's no pride in England. So I'm not quite, as John said, if the audience paint their face and don the national color, etc., etc. Yes, we can probably see it as a very clear indication as to how much they are prepared to be identified with that particular idea of Scottish team or etc., etc. But the pride in national team, I'm not quite sure how it really works.
Okay, we're slowly getting towards the end of our event, so I'd like to give all of you sort of a chance for a quick bullet round if you have anything to add. I have to apologize to all of the members and people who've asked questions. Some of them we've partially answered, others we haven't. But there's been too many, if I'm being perfectly honest. But I'd like to give our panelists sort of a chance for some concluding remarks, and I'll start the other way around this time, if that's fine. Sorry, Richard, if I caught you off guard there. And sort of just to wrap up, sort of your thoughts, sort of also what these kinds of events like today, you've mentioned it as sort of as trigger moments for further cross-disciplinary, and I don't want to call it cross-disciplinary because we're all sort of in nationalism studies and we have to understand it as an interdisciplinary field, but how do we get people really talking to each other and not doing this separately? And I think also that this is sort of a perfect example of scholars like all of you yourself clearly pointing out how not just how important sport can potentially be historically for the creation of nations, but also today, sort of in the everyday creation of collective identities and national belonging, but also how rewarding it can be, and how there's a myriad and a plethora of potential research questions that is just out there looking, waiting to be researched upon. So yeah, without further ado, sort of a quick bullet round. Richard, word is yours.
Right, I'm sorry I missed some of that because my internet connection is unstable, so apparently. So you broke up for a while. But how can we get people talking more to each other? It's an interesting question. I think soliciting calls for papers, when I was the guest editor for Problems Post-Communism on the 2 occasions where I've done that, we solicited calls for papers and we explicitly advocated approaches from all over, because I think we're all studying the same thing. So we weren't looking for particular, it didn't have to be one particular way or the other. So I think that's an interesting way. And I think, like we said, events like this. And I like the idea of having just published an edited volume. I do think edited volumes are an interesting way of getting a plurality of voices and methodological approaches. That was the only question I heard of yours, I'm afraid. So I don't have any answers to any others. Oh, and I just wanted to add, I was when we were talking about the displays of nationalism in stadia, and the fact that this is something that people do voluntarily and they openly, they want to be identified as belonging to anything group. I was thinking about the ways in which the nation was contested in the composition of the national team, and my mind goes back to Marine. I think it was Marine, or not her father, Marine Le Pen, who complained about the composition of the French team, even though they won the World Cup in 2002. And the fact that Mario Balotelli has been, he's been subject to some really nasty comments, even though he's playing for, or he was playing for, one of the great Italian clubs. So.
John, may I give you the word?
Yeah, so thanks, Dario, for inviting us to take part in this. I mean, it's mainly focus on nationalism in sports and ideas about how to think about this. I mean, some of the stuff Richard was talking about how you learn about the nation through participation in sports. So it's not just obviously about collective effervescence. I mean, I'm aware of that, but even from an everyday nationhood perspective, I think there's a lot to think about about how everyday nationhood and sport connect. And so yeah, I mean, it's like anything else, talking about things and sharing perspectives and then also publishing, of course, those perspectives as well as ways to encourage. Frankly, I can't figure out why people love to talk about sport and they love to talk about nationalism. Why don't they combine the two? I don't get it. So yeah, you know, it's there for the taking.
I think Alan is certainly the one person who loves to talk about nationalism and sports and is very knowledgeable on both. So Alan, maybe your final thoughts.
There's been a bit of talk today about edited volumes and possibly special issues of journals. One special issue that I would draw people's attention to, I don't know how far down the road it is. I know some of the contributions are online now. But as a piece that's with the guest editor Stuart Egan at Oxford Brookes University, and it's an attempt to get people to refer to particular theories of nationalism and then use these in relation to sport. Atsuko's former PhD student Anthony May and I have done something for that on primordialism in relation to sport in Scotland and in the Black Country in the North of England. And I think that particular special issue might be quite significant. Again, I rather suspect because it's sporting society, the majority of contributors will be from sports studies, if you like. And I think a journal like that should have, and I don't know because I haven't seen the full lineup, but if it could, if journals of that sort with special issues could reach out to both communities, then I think that would help as well, so that people became more familiar with work in different areas of research on the nation.
Atsuko, your final thoughts?
Not much to add, but I was kind of thinking, we all agree that the international sporting structure gives some kind of a means for those people who want to establish identities to concretize it. I was thinking about Hong Kong, the Hong Kong football team, when they just, the Hong Kong spectators refused to sing the Chinese national anthem and basically boo it. It's been obviously banned for a while, but that's one of the ways Hong Kongers, normal, ordinary Hong Kongers, are just saying we are Hong Kongers rather than Chinese, and we want to be Hong Kongers rather than becoming Chinese. So I think kind of sports as a way of resistance might be one interesting way to try not to be kind of trapped in a kind of loop of doing the same thing, as you said, Dario, that adding everything without innovating. Perhaps that's one thing we may be able to do.
Thank you very much, Atsuko. Well, unfortunately, we ran out of time very, very quickly. That's the way that linear time unfortunately works. The concept of it. I'd like to thank all of the panelists who joined us today. I'd like to thank all of the participants who've joined us, who've asked questions on multiple platforms, from Zoom to YouTube to Facebook. And would like to close this event with an announcement. This is just sort of the first of 2 events that we're planning. This one was more sort of a contextual one to talk about sort of the issue of why sport has remained peripheral. What are theoretical sort of insights into getting people talking about sports and nationalism studies. And the sort of the second event that we're planning, David from ASEN and myself, is going to be more methodologically driven. It's going to be confirmed the date, but it's end of June, where we're going to invite panelists to talk about their particular research in sport and nationalism studies from a variety of methodological and disciplinary perspectives, quantitative, qualitative. So some of the questions that we've sort of touched upon today will be talked through in much more detail. And also just to reiterate what Alan has said, Stuart Wigham has been also invited to participate, who's an editor of a fairly recently published special issue on sport and nationalism theory. So we're looking to get a little bit more sort of palpable in how do we approach this issue, and how do we find innovative ways of researching sport and the nation. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you once again, to all of our viewers, and would like to wish you a pleasant afternoon, or whatever time of the day it is from where you're watching this right now. Thank you very much. Bye.